Good evening, good evening. How are y'all doing? Well, we're back again. Hopefully in a little bit more of a cozy state than before. I livened up the image you see on screen with some pictures of Dewey. Um, did a little bit of research into Dewey and found that the title of the book is a little hyperbolic in that it talks about, we've cat who touched the world. Um, but he was for sure not just like a small impact. It was a big thing. So I think what may help us here is continuing to dig a little deeper, read a little further. And I've got my lights down low, a little different color. I don't know how well that's going to impact my ability to read. I imagine not very badly. But I've got pictures of Dewey on screen, so if you want to know about the cat we're reading about, we've got it on screen. I won't take up too much time before we get started, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who showed up last night and sat and read with us and heard everything out. Appreciate anybody who joins moving forward and really wants to dig deeper. If you're interested in watching the first three chapters or listening to the first three chapters, they're available on my YouTube channel. I'm going to go ahead and post those or post that link in chat now for anybody who wants to go and listen to the first three chapters before coming back. Typically, I'm going to aim to have these VODs out on that YouTube channel same night. But like you can see, we're back in ZOS. Let me make a quick adjustment here. Move him over just a bit. There we go. So, I guess without further ado, before we get too far into idle conversation and bunch of nonsense, I guess let's get started. So let's see here. Alrighty. Chapter 4. A Day in the Library. Cats are creatures of habit, and it didn't take long for Dewey to develop a routine. When I arrived at the library every morning, he was waiting for me at the front door. He'd take a few bites of his food while I hung up my jacket and bag, and then we would walk the library together, making sure everything was in place and discussing our evenings. Dewey is more of a sniffer than a talker, but I didn't mind. The library, once so cold and dead first thing in the morning, was alive and well. After our walk, Dewey would visit the staff. If someone was having a bad morning, he'd spend extra time with them. Jean Hollis Clark had recently married and commuted 45 minutes from Esterville to the library. You'd think that would frazzle her, but Jean was the calmest person you'd ever met. The only thing that bothered her, sorry, they have a lot of weird separations of words. The only thing that bothered her was the friction between a couple people on staff. She'd still be carrying the tension when she arrived the next morning, and Dewey was always there to comfort her. He had an amazing sense of who needed him, and he was always willing to give his time, but never for too long. At 2 minutes to 9, Dewey would drop whatever he was doing and race to the front door. A patron was always waiting outside at 9 o'clock when he opened the doors, and she would usually enter with a warm, "Hi Dewey, how are you this morning?" "Welcome, welcome," I imagined him saying from his post left of the door. "Why don't you pet the cat?" No response. The early birds were usually there for a reason, which means they didn't have time to stop and chat with the cat. No petting? Fine. There's always another person where you came from, wherever that is. It wouldn't take long for him to find a lap, and since he'd been up for 2 hours, it usually meant it was time for a quick nap. Dewey was already so comfortable in the library, and he had no problem falling asleep in public places. He preferred laps, of course, but if they weren't available, he'd curl up in a box. The cards for the catalog The cards for the catalog came in small boxes about the size of a pair of baby shoes. Dewey liked to cram all 4 feet inside, sit down, and let his sides ooze over the edge. If the box was a little bigger, he buried his head and tail and bottom. The only thing you could see was a big blob of back fur sticking out of the top. He looked like a muffin. One morning I found Dewey sleeping beside a box full of cards with one paw resting inside. It probably took him hours to reluctantly admit there wasn't room for anything else. Soon after, I watched him slowly wind his way into a half-empty tissue box. He put 2 front feet through the slit in the top, then delicately slipped in with the other 2. Slowly, he sat down on his hind legs and rolled his back end until he wedged himself into the box. Then he started bending his front legs and working the front of his body into the crease. The operation took 4 or 5 minutes, but finally there was nothing left of him but his head sticking out in one direction and his tail sticking out the other. I watched as he stared half-lidded into the distance, pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. In those days, Iowa provided envelopes with its tax forms, and we always put a box of them out for patrons. Dewey must have spent half his winter curled up in that box. I need 1 envelope, a patron would say nervously. But I don't want to disturb Dewey. What should I do? Don't worry. He's asleep. But won't it wake him up? He's lying on top of them. Oh no, Dew's dead to the world. The patron gently rolled Dewey to the side and then, far more carefully than necessary, slid out an envelope. He could have jerked it like a magician pulling a tablecloth out from under a dinner setting, but it wouldn't have mattered. Cat hair comes with the envelope. No charge. Dewey's other favorite resting spot was on the back of the copier. Don't worry, I told the confused patrons. You can't disturb him. He sleeps there because it's warm. The more copies you make, the more heat the machine produces, the happier he'll be. If the patients weren't quite sure what to do with Dewey yet, the staff had no such hesitations. One of my first decisions was that with no library funds, not 1 penny would ever be spent on Dewey's care. Instead, we kept a Dewey box in the back room. Everyone on staff tossed in their loose change. Most of us also brought in soda cans from home. Recycling soda cans was all the rage, and one of the clerks, Cynthia Behrens, would take the cans to a drop-off point every week. The whole staff was feeding the kitty to feed the kitty. In return for these small contributions, we get endless hours of pleasure. Dewey loved drawers and developed a habit of popping out of them when you least expect it. If you were shelving books, he'd jump onto the cart and demand a trip around the library. And when Kim Peterson, the library secretary, started typing, you knew a show was about to begin. As soon as I heard those keys, I'd put down my work and wait for the signal. Dewey's after the clacker thingies again, Kim would call out. I hurry out of my office and find Dewey hunched on the back of Kim's big white typewriter. His head would be jerking from side to side as the desk moved left and right, back again, until he finally couldn't take it anymore and lunged at the clacky thingies, which were nothing more than the keys rising to strike the paper. The whole staff would have been there watching and laughing. Dewey's antics always drew a crowd. This is important. Everyone at the library was well-intentioned, but over the years, staff had become splintered and cliquish. Only Doris Armstrong, who was older and possibly wiser than the rest of us, had managed to stay friends with everyone. She had a large desk in the middle of the staff area where she covered each of the new books with a plastic protective sleeve, and her humor and good cheer held us together. She was also our biggest cat lover, and soon her desk was one of Dewey's favorite spots. He would sprawl there in the late morning, batting at her big sheets of plastic, the new center of attention and the mutual friend of everyone on staff. Here, finally, was something we could just share, just as important. He was a friend to all our children, or in Doris's case, grandchildren too. Nothing concrete happened. No one apologized or discussed their issues, for instance, but once Dewey arrived, the tension began to lift. We were laughing. We were happier. Dewey had brought us together. But no matter how much fun Dewey was having, he never forgot his routine. At exactly 10:30, he would hop up and head for the staff room. Jean Hollis Clark ate yogurt on her break, and if he hung around long enough, she'd let him lick the lid. Jean was quiet and hard-working, but she always found ways to accommodate Dewey. If Dewey wanted downtime, he would lie limply over Jean's left shoulder, and only her left shoulder, never her right, when she filed papers. After a few months, Dewey wouldn't let us hold him, cradled in our arms anymore. Too much like a baby, I suppose. So the whole staff adopted Jean's over-the-shoulder technique. We called it the Dewey carry. Can I get a hashtag Dewey carry in chat? Dewey helped me with downtime too, which was nice since I had a tendency to work too hard. Many days I'd be hunched over my desk for hours, so intent on budget numbers or progress reports that I wouldn't even realize Dewey was there until he sprang into my lap. "How you doing, baby boy?" I'd say with a smile. "So nice to see you." I'd pet him for a few times before turning back to my work. Unsatisfied, he'd climb onto my desk and start sniffing. "Oh, you just happened to sit on the paper I'm working on, didn't you? Purely a coincidence." I put him on the floor. He hopped back out. "Not now, Dewey, I'm busy." I put him back down. He hopped back up. Maybe if I ignored him. Pushed his head against my pencil. I pushed him aside. "Fine," he thought. "I'll knock these pens to the ground," which he proceeded to do, one pen at a time, watching each one fall. I couldn't help but laugh. "Okay, Dewey, you win." I wadded up a piece of paper and threw it to him. He ran after it, sniffed it, then came back. Typical cat. Always one to play, never one to fetch. I walked over, picked up the paper, tossed it a few more times. "What am I going to do with you?" But it wasn't all jokes and games. I was the boss and I had responsibilities, like giving the cat a bath. The first time I bathed Dewey, I was confident things would go well. He loved the bath. He loved that bath that first morning, right? This time, Dewey slid into the sink like a block of ice dropped into a vat of acid. He thrashed, he screamed, he put his feet on the edge of the sink and tried to throw his body over the side. I held him down with both arms. 20 minutes later, I was covered in water. I was covered in water. My hair looked like I had stuck my tongue in a light socket. Everybody laughed, including, eventually, me. Third bath was just as bad. I managed to get Dewey scrubbed, but I didn't have the patience for toweling and blow drying. Not this crazy kitten. "Fine," I told him. "If you hate it that much, just go." Dewey was a vain cat. He would spend an hour washing his face until he got it just right. The funniest part was the way he would always ball up his fist, lick it, and then shove it into his ears. He would work on those ears until they were sparkling white. Now, soaking wet, he looked like a chihuahua crushed by a wave of toupees. It was pathetic. But the staff was laughing and taking pictures, but Dewey looked so genuinely upset that after a few minutes the picture stopped. "Have a sense of humor, Dew," I teased him. "You brought this on yourself." He crawled up behind a shelf of books and didn't come out for hours. After that, Dewey and I agreed that 2 baths a year were plenty. The bath is nothing," I told Dewey a few months into his stay at the library, wrapping him up in his green towel. "You're not going to like this at all." Dewey never rode in a cage. It was much too like that night in the box. Whenever I took him out of the library, I just wrapped him up in his green towel. 5 minutes later, we arrived at Dr. Esterly's office at the other end of town. There were several veterinarians in Spencer, after all. We lived in an area prone to breech-birth cows, distressed hogs, and sick farm dogs, but I preferred Dr. Esterly. He was a quiet, self-effacing man with an extremely deliberate way of speaking. His voice was deep and slow like a lazy river. He didn't rush. He was always tidy. He was a big man, but his hands were gentle. He was conscientious and efficient. He knew his job, he loved animals, and his authority came from his lack of words, not his use of them. "Hi, Dewey," he said, checking him over. "Do you think this is absolutely necessary, Doctor?" "Cats need to be neutered." I looked down at Dewey's tiny paws, which had finally healed. There were tufts of fur sticking out from between his toes. Toes? Do you think he's part Russian? Or part Persian, rather? Dr. Esterly looked at Dewey, his regal bearing, the glorious ruff of a long orange fur wrapped around his neck. He was a lion in alley cat clothing. "No, he's just a good-looking alley cat." I didn't believe it for a second. Dewey is the product of the survival of the fittest, Dr. Esterly continued. His ancestors have probably lived in that alley for generations. So he's one of us. Dr. Esterly smiled. I suppose so. He picked Dewey up and held him under his arm. Dewey was relaxed and purring. The last thing Dr. Esterly said before they disappeared around the corner was, Dewey is one fine cat. He sure was, and I missed him already. When I picked Dewey up the next morning, my heart almost broke in two. He had a faraway look in his eyes and a little shaved belly. I took him into my arms. He pushed his head against my arm and started purring. He was so happy to see his old pal Vicky, who, by the way, is the author of Vicky Myron. Back at the library, the staff dropped everything. Poor baby. I gave them over to their care. He was our mutual friend after all and went back to work. One more set of hands and he might be crushed. Besides, the trip to the vet's office had put me behind, and I had a mountain of work. I needed two of me to do this job right, but the city would never have paid for it, so I was stuck with myself. But I wasn't alone. An hour later, as I was hanging up the phone, I looked to see Dewey hobbling through my office door. I knew he'd been getting love and attention from the rest of the staff, but I could tell from his determined wobbling that he needed something more. Sure, cats can be fun, but my relationship with Dewey was already far more complex and intimate. He was so intelligent, he was so playful, he treated people so well. I didn't yet have a deep bond with him, but even now near the beginning, I loved him. And he loved me back. Not like he loved everyone else, but in a special and deeper way. The look he gave me the first morning meant something, it really did. Never was that more clear than now as he pushed toward me with such determination. I could almost hear him saying, "Where have you been? I've missed you." I reached down, scooped him up, cradled him against my chest. I don't know if I said it out loud or to myself, but it didn't matter. Dewey could have read my moods, if not my mind. I'm your mama, aren't I? Dewey put his head on my shoulder, right up against my neck, and purred. Chapter 5. Catnip and Rubber Bands. Don't get me wrong, everything wasn't perfect with the Dew. Yes, he was sweet and a beautiful cat, and yes, he was extraordinarily trusting and generous, but he was still a kitten. Ooh. Well, before we get started, I forgot, much as I've shown every other time, there is a picture of the Dew being playful. Lovely boy. So, but he was still a kitten. He'd streak maniacally through the staff room. He'd knock your work to the floor out of pure playfulness. He was too immature to know who really needed him, and he sometimes wouldn't take no for an answer when a patron wanted to be left alone. At story hour, his presence made the children so rambunctious and unpredictable that Mary Walk, our children's librarian, banned him from the room. Then there was Mark, a large puppet of a child with muscular dystrophy. We used Mark to teach school children about disabilities. There was so much cat hair on Mark's legs that we finally put him in a closet. Dewey worked all night until he figured out how to open that closet and went right back to sleeping on Mark's lap. We bought a lock for the closet the next day. But nothing compared to his behavior around Catnip. Doris Armstrong was always bringing Dewey presents, and such as little balls or toys or mice. Doris had cats of her own, and like the consummate mother that I can't speak tonight. And like the consummate mother hen, she always thought of Dewey when she went to the pet store for their litter and food. One day, near the end of Dewey's first summer, she quite innocently brought a bag of fresh catnip. Dewey was so excited by the smell, I thought he was going to climb her leg. For the first time in his life, the cat actually begged. When Doris finally crumbled a few leaves onto the floor, Dewey went crazy. He started smelling them so hard I thought he was going to inhale the floor. After a few sniffs, he started sneezing, but he didn't slow down. Instead, he started chewing the leaves, and then alternating back and forth, chewing, sniffing, chewing, sniffing. His muscles started to ripple, a slow cascade of tension flowing out of his bones and down his back. When he finally shook that tension out of the end of his tail, he flopped over on the ground and rolled back and forth in the catnip. He rolled until he lost every bone in his body. Unable to walk, he slithered on the floor, undulating as he rubbed his chin along the carpet like a snowplow blade. The cat oozed. Then, gradually, his spine bent backward in a slow motion until his head was resting on his behind. He formed figure eights, zigzags, pretzels. I swear, the front half of his body wasn't even connected to the back half. When he finally and accidentally ended up flat on his tummy, he rippled his way back to the catnip and started rolling in it again. Most of the leaves were now stuck in his fur, but he kept sniffing and chewing. Finally, he stretched out on his back and started kicking his chin with his back legs. This lasted until, with a few flailing kicks and hanging feebly in the air, Dewey passed out right on top of the last of the catnip. Doris and I looked at each other in amazement, then burst out laughing. My goodness, it was funny. Dewey never tired of catnip. He would often sniff half-heartedly at old, worn-out leaves. But if there were fresh leaves in the library, Dewey knew it. And every time he got a hold of catnip, it was the same thing. The undulating back, the rolling, the slithering, the bending, the kicking, and finally one very tired, very comatose cat. We called it the Dewey Mambo. Dewey's other interest, besides puppets, drawers, boxes, copiers, typewriters, and catnip, was rubber bands. Dewey was absolutely fanatical about rubber bands. Didn't even need to see them. He could smell them across the library. As soon as you put a box of rubber bands on your desk, he was there. Here you go, Dewey, I would often say as I opened up a new bag. One for you and one for me. He would take his rubber band in his mouth and happily skip away. I would find it the next morning in his litter box. It looked like a worm poking its head out of a chunk of dirt. I thought, that can't be good. Dewey always attended staff meetings, but fortunately he wasn't yet able to understand what we were talking about. A few years down the road, that cat and I were able to have long philosophical conversations, but for right now, it was just easy to wrap up the meeting with a simple reminder. Don't give Dewey any more rubber bands. I don't care how much he begs. He's been eating them, and I have a feeling rubber isn't the healthiest food for a growing kitten. The next day, there were more rubber band worms in Dewey's litter, and the next staff meeting, I was a bit more direct. Is anyone giving Dewey rubber bands? No. Then he must be stealing them. From now on, you can't leave rubber bands lying out on your desk. Easier said than done. Much, much easier than done. You would be amazed how many rubber bands there are in the library. We put all of our rubber band holders away, but that didn't even dent the problem. Rubber bands apparently are sneaky critters. They slide under computer keyboards and crawl into your pencil holder. They fall under your desk and hide in your wires. One evening I caught Dewey rummaging through a stack of work on someone's desk. There was a rubber band lurking every time he pushed a piece of paper aside. Even the hidden ones need to go, I said at the next staff meeting. Let's clean up those desks and put them away. Remember, Dewey can smell rubber. In a few days, the staff area looked neater than it had in years. So, Dewey started raiding the rubber bands left out on the circulation desk for patrons. We stashed them in a drawer. He found the rubber bands by the copier, too. The patrons were just going to have to ask for rubber bands. A small price to pay, I thought, in exchange for a cat who spent most of his day trying to make him happy. Soon, our counter operation was showing signs of success. There were still worms in litter box, but not as many. And Dewey was being forced into brazenness. Every time I pulled out a rubber band, he was watching me. Getting desperate, are we? No, just seeing what's going on. As soon as I put the rubber band down, Dewey pounced. I pushed him away, and he sat on the desk, waiting for his chance. Not this time, Dewey, I said with a grin. I admit it, this game was fun. Dewey became more subtle. He waited for you to turn your back, then pounced on your rubber band, left innocently lying on your desk. It had been there 5 minutes. Humans forget, not cats. Dewey remembered every drawer left open a crack, then came back that night to wiggle his way inside. He never messed up the contents of that drawer. The next morning, the rubber bands were simply gone. One afternoon, I was walking past our big floor-to-ceiling supply cabinet. I was focused on something else, probably budget numbers, and only noticed the open door out of the corner of my eyes. Did I just see? I turned around and walked back towards the cabinet. Sure enough, there was Dewey, sitting on the shelf at eye level, a huge rubber band hanging out of his mouth. You can't stop the dew. I'm going to be feasting for a week. I had to laugh. In general, Dewey was the best behaved kitten I'd ever seen. He never knocked books over or displays off shelves. If I told him not to do something, he usually stopped. He was unfailingly kind to stranger and staffer alike. For a kitten, he was downright mellow, but he was absolutely incorrigible when it came to any rubber bands. The cat would go anywhere to do anything to sink his teeth into another rubber band. Hold on, Dewey, I told him, putting down my pile of work. I'm going to get a picture of this. By the time I got back with the camera, the cat and his rubber band were gone. Make sure all the cabinets and drawers are completely closed, I reminded the staff. Dewey was already notorious. He had a habit of getting inside closed cabinets and drawers and then leaping out at the next person to open them. We weren't sure if it was a game or an accident, but Dewey clearly enjoyed it. A few mornings later, I found file cards sitting suspiciously unbound on the front desk. Dewey had never gone for tight rubber bands before now. He was biting them off every night. As always, he was delicate even in defiance. He left perfectly neat stacks, not a card out of place. The cards went into drawers, the drawers were shut tight. By the fall of 1988, you could spend an entire day in the Spencer Public Library without seeing a rubber band. Oh, they were still there, but they were squirreled away and only those with opposable thumbs could get to them. It was the ultimate cleaning operation. The library looked beautiful, and we were proud of our accomplishment, except for one problem. Dewey was still chewing rubber bands. I put a crack investigative team to follow all leads. It took us 2 days to find Dewey's last good source. The coffee mug on Mary Walk's desk. Mary, I said, flipping a notebook like the police detective in a bad television drama, we have reason to believe that the rubber bands are coming from your mug. That's impossible. I've never seen Dewey around my desk. Evidence suggests the suspect is intentionally avoiding your desk to throw us off the trail. We believe he only approaches your mug at night. What evidence? I pointed to several small pieces of chewed rubber band on the floor. He chews them up and then spits them out. He eats them for breakfast. I think you know all the usual cliches. Mary shuddered at the thought of the garbage on the floor having passed into and out of the stomach of a cat. Still, it seems so improbable. The mug is 6 inches deep. It's full of paper clips, staples, pens, and pencils. How could he possibly pluck out rubber bands without knocking everything over? Where there's a will, there's a way, and this suspect has proven in his 8 months at the library that he has the will. But there are hardly any rubber bands in there. Surely this isn't his only source. How about an experiment? You put the mug in the cabinet and we'll see if he pukes rubber bands near your desk. But this mug has my children's pictures on it. Good point. How about we remove the rubber bands? Mary decided to put a lid on the mug. The next morning, the lid was lying on her desk with suspicious teak marks all around the edge. No doubt about it, the mug was the source. The rubber bands went into a drawer. Convenience was sacrificed for the greater good. We never completely succeeded in wiping out Dewey's rubber band fixation. He'd lose interest only to go back on the prowl a few months or even a few years later. In the end, it was more of a game than a battle a contest of wits and guile. While we had the wits, Dewey had the guile and the will. He was far more intent on eating rubber bands than we were at stopping him, and he had the more powerful rubber-sniffing nose. But let's not make too much of it all. Rubber bands were a hobby. Catnip and boxes were distractions. Dewey's true love was people, and there was nothing I wouldn't do for his adoring public. Nothing he wouldn't do for his adoring public. I remember standing at the circulation desk one morning talking with Doris when we noticed a toddler wobbling by. She must have recently learned to walk because her balance was shaky and her steps were uneven. It wasn't helping that her arms were wrapped tightly across her chest, clutching Dewey in a bear hug. His rear and tail were sticking up in her face, and his head were hanging down toward the floor. Doris and I stopped talking and watched in amazement as this little girl toddled in slow motion across the library, a very big smile on her face, and a very resigned cat hanging upside down from her arms. Amazing, Doris said. I should do something about that, I said, but I didn't. I knew that, despite appearances, Dewey was in complete control of the situation. He knew what he was doing, and no matter what happened, he could take care of himself. We think of the library or any single building, really, as a small place. How can you spend all day, every day, in a 13,000 square foot room and not get bored? But to Dewey, the Spencer Public Library was a huge world full of drawers, cabinets, bookshelves, display cases, rubber bands, typewriters, copiers, tables, chairs, backpacks, purses, and a steady stream of hands to pet him, legs to rub him, and mouths to sing his praises. And laps. The library was always graciously, gorgeously full of laps. By the fall of 1988, Dewey considered all of it his. That was chapter 5. I'm going to pause for a minute and grab a glass of water, and I'll be right back. Alrighty, and I'm back. Drink your water. Hydrate. It's good for you. Okay. We're moving on to chapter 6. Moneta, or Moneta. And of course, little Dewey, all curled up. So cute. Chapter 6. Size is a matter of perspective. For an insect, one stalk of corn, or even one ear of corn, can be the whole world. For Dewey, the Spencer Public Library was a labyrinth that kept him endlessly fascinated, at least until he started to wonder what was outside the front door. For most of the people in northwest Iowa, Spencer is the big city. In fact, we are the biggest city for 100 miles in any direction. People from 9 counties funneled to Spencer for entertainment and shopping. We have stores, services, live music, local theater, and, of course, the county fair. What more do you need? There was a front door leading to the Grand Avenue. If there was a front door leading from Grand Avenue to the rest of the world, most people around here wouldn't have any interest in going through it. In junior high school, I remember being scared of girls from Spencer, not because I'd ever met any, but because they were from the big city. Like most people around here, I grew up on a farm. Actually, let me turn that down a bit. I realize that's a little bit loud. In junior high school, I remember being scared of girls from Spencer, not because I'd met any, but because they were from the big city. Like most people around here, I grew up on a farm. My great aunt Luna was the first school teacher in Clay County. She taught class out of a one-room sod house. There have never been trees out here on the prairie, so the settlers built with what they could find: grass, roots, soil, and all. My great-grandfather, Norman Gibson, was the one who amassed enough land to grant a farmstead to each of his 6 children. No matter where I went as a kid, I was surrounded by my father's family. Most of the Gibsons were staunch Baptists, and they didn't wear pants. How are those two things related? All right, the men wore pants religiously. The women wore dresses. Never saw a pair of slacks on any woman on my father's side. Ooh, I think I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me, guys. In time, my father inherited his land and started his hard work of running a family farm. But first, he learned how to dance. Dancing was off limits to most Baptists. But Valerin Gibson was 15 years younger than his 4 siblings, and his parents indulged him. As a young man, Jip would slip out and drive the truck for an hour to the Roof Garden, a 1920s Gilded Era resort on the edge of Lake Okoboji, for their Friday night dances. Okoboji is a mystical name in Iowa. West Okoboji, the centerpiece of a chain of 5 lakes, is the only blue water, spring-fed lake in the state. And people come from Nebraska and even Minnesota, a state with very few lakes of its own, to the hotels along its shore. In the late 1940s, it was the hottest spot in the area, maybe even the whole state of Iowa. Every big-name swing band played in the joint, the Roof Garden, and often the ballroom was so packed you couldn't move. World War II was over, and the party seemed like it would go on forever. Outside on the boardwalk, there was a roller coaster, Ferris wheel, and enough lights, sounds, and pretty girls to make you forget that Lake Okoboji was a brilliant blue pinprick in the vast emptiness of the great American plains. And there, in that little circle of light, Jip Gibson met Marie Mayu. Mayu? M-A-Y-O-U? Mayu? They danced the night away and just about every other night for the next 6 months. My father kept the relationship a secret because he knew his family would never approve. The Mayus weren't like the Gibsons. They were full-blooded French by the way of Montreal, and they were fiery, passionate people. They loved hard, fought hard, drank hard, and even churched hard, with a no-nonsense Midwestern Catholicism that almost scorched the earth. The Mayus owned the town cafe in Royal, Iowa, about 10 miles from Dad's farm. My mother's father was a wonderful man. Gregarious, honest, kind. He was also a full-blown alcoholic. Okay? As a child, Mom would leave school to work the lunch rush, then head back to school a few hours in the afternoon. Often her father would be passed out in one of the booths, so Mom would have to get him up off the bed to get out of the way Mom would have to get him off to bed and out of the way of the paying customers. It wasn't Mary Mayu's family that was notorious. 10 miles was a long way in 1940s Iowa. The problem was that they were Catholic, so Mom and Dad ran away to Minnesota to get married. The wound from the elopement took a few years to heal, but practical always prevails in Iowa. If a deed is done, it's time to move on. Mom and Dad settled down on the family farm soon had their first 3 of 6 children, 2 boys, David and Mike, and a girl. I was the middle child. The family farm, The idea had been romanticized, but most of the history of the world family farming has been a difficult, poorly paid, back-breaking enterprise. The gypsum farm was no different. We had a cold water hand pump in the kitchen that you physically had to prime. We had a washing machine in the root cellar, but you had to heat the water on the stove upstairs. After the clothes were washed, you cranked them one by one through rollers to wring out the excess water, then hung them up outside on the line. We had a shower in the corner of the root cellar. The walls were concrete, but we had tile on the floor. That was our luxury. Air conditioning? I didn't know such a thing existed. Mom worked in her kitchen 6 hours a day over an open flame, and even in 100-degree heat. The kids slept upstairs, and it was so hot on humid summer nights that we'd take our pillows downstairs and sleep on the dining room floor. Linoleum was the coolest surface in the house. Indoor plumbing. Until I was 10 years old, we used a one-hole outhouse. When the outhouse became full, you simply dug a new hole and moved the shack. Hard to believe now, but looking back, it's true. It was the best childhood, the very best. I disagree. I wouldn't trade it for all the money in Des Moines. Why worry about new toys and clothes? No one knew we had those. We handed down clothes. We handed down toys. There was no television, so we talked to each other. Our big trip was once a year into the municipal swimming pool in Spencer. Every morning we woke up together and then we worked together. When I was 10, Mom and Dad had their second set of 3 children, Stephen, Val, and Doug. I raised those children alongside Mom. We were gypsies. We were there for each other. It's dark on a farm at night and empty and lonely, but I knew there was nothing out there in the world that could harm me. Not the Russians, not rockets, not thieves. I had my family, and if things got really bad, I had the cornfield. I could always run into it and disappear. We weren't really alone, of course. Each square mile of farmland bordered by all sides by those perfectly straight Iowa roads was called a section. In those days, most sections held 4 family-owned farms. 3.5 of the families in our section were Catholic. 3.5 of the families in our section were Catholic. We were the other half. And there were 17 children among them, so we had our own baseball game. Even if only 4 kids showed up, we played baseball. I can't remember thinking about any other game. I was small, but by the time I was 12, I could hit a baseball across the ditch and into the corn. Every night we huddled around the gypsum family table to give thanks to God that we'd gone another day without losing our baseball in the corn. 2 miles from our eastern field, at the end of the second section, was the town of Moneta, Iowa. Spencer and Moneta were only 20 miles apart, but they might as well have been in different worlds. Some might call that 20-mile stretch nondescript, but if you drive it in September when the sky is darkening with blue storm clouds and the crops form patches in glorious shades of brown, you'd be hard-pressed not to call it beautiful. The highlight is probably the faded wooden billboard outside the town of Everly saluting 1966 Iowa girls basketball champions. I remember that team. Everly beat us to a point in the regional finals which were held in Spencer. I tell you about that game, but it had already taken longer to mention the sign than it takes to pass through Everly, which only has 500 people. The population of Moneta never reached 500, but it topped that number if you included all the farmers, like my family, who thought of themselves as members of that wonderful community. In the 1930s, Moneta was the gambling capital of northwest Iowa. The restaurants on Main Street the restaurant on Main Street was a speakeasy, and there was a gambling hall in the back accessible through a secret door. By the time I was a child, those legends were long gone, replaced in our imaginations by the baseball fields and the bees. Every community has something the children remember. Come to Spencer in 60 years and the older people say, "We had a cat. He lived in the library. What was his name? Oh yes, Dewey." Always remember Dewey. In Moneta, it was the bees. The local family had 60 hives, and the honey was famous in 4 counties, which seemed like the whole world. The centerpiece of town, though, was the Moneta School, a 10-room, 2-story red brick building just down the road from the baseball field. Almost everyone in town had attended the Moneta School, at least for a few years. There were only 8 children in my grade, but what we lacked in size we made up for in amenities. 2 local women cooked homemade meals for the whole school every day. Janet and I, the only girls in our class, often got special permission to go over in the morning and frost the cinnamon rolls. If you had a problem, a teacher would walk you to the hidden circle in the grove and trees behind the school where you could talk it out one-on-one. If you wanted to be alone or with a special someone, you went to the grove too. That's where I got my first kiss. The Moneta school had a party at the end of every year with sack races, horse races, and of course, baseball games. The whole town brought picnics. Everybody participated. In the middle of the summer, when the corn was so high it surrounded the town like a wall, there was a Moneta school reunion, which in the 1950s drew several thousand people. Everyone was proud of that school. Everyone. Then, in 1959, the state of Iowa shuttered the Moneta school. The town had been on a long population slide, and the state could no longer justify the expense. Moneta had always been a hub for local farmers, but farming was changing. In the early 1950s, the first generation of giant harvesters and combines allowed farmers to plow and harvest larger fields. Some farmers bought new machines, then bought out their neighbors and doubled their production, then used that money to buy out more of their neighbors. Farm families began to disappear, moving away to local population centers like Spencer, and with them went the farmhouses, family gardens, and the rows of trees the original settlers had planted to protect the house from the summer sun, winter wind. These were huge trees, 5 feet around and 100 years old. When large farmers moved in, they bulldozed everything. Trees, buildings, everything, piled it up and burned it to the ground. Why keep a house nobody's living in when you could have a field? The land went back, not to nature. It went to corn. The old family farmers raised livestock. They planted the gardens. They grew crops in distinct smaller fields. On the large new farms, there was only corn and its companion crop, soybeans. Every year, Iowa grew more corn, but we ate less and less of the crop, at least as kernels and cobs. Most was used as animal feed. Some eventually became ethanol. The rest was separated, broken down, and processed. Have you ever wondered what xanthan gum is? It's processed corn. Like almost everything else in the long list of unidentifiable ingredients printed on the packaging of your dinner, 70% of the average American diet, 70%, is corn. But life in farm country isn't easy. A few large farms are worth a fortune, but most farmers and the people who rely on them, farm hands, salesmen, storage facilities, processing plants, local merchants, the money is tight, the work is hard, and life is often beyond your control. If it doesn't rain, if it doesn't stop raining, if it gets too hot or too cold, if prices don't hold up when your product hits market, there's not much more you can do. Farm life isn't 40 acres and a mule anymore. Farmers need large combines to plow big fields, and they can cost $500,000 or more. Throw in seed, chemicals, and living expenses, and a farmer's debt can easily top $1 million. If they stumble or fall behind the times, or simply have a run of bad luck, most can't make it. The same is true in towns and farm country. The same is true of the towns and farm country. Towns are, after all, a collection of people. The town relies on the people, and people rely on the town. Like the pollen and corn silk, they are interdependent. That's why the people of Northwest Iowa take such pride in their towns. That's why they invest so much energy in making their towns work. They plant trees, they build parks, they join community organizations. They know if a town is not constantly looking ahead, it can fall behind, then it can die. Some people think the grain elevator burning down in the 1930s ruined the town of Moneta. I think it was the closing of the Moneta school. After the Gypsum kids started being bused 10 miles away to Hartley in 1959, Dad lost interest in struggling against the farm. Our land didn't produce, and Dad couldn't afford big new machinery. He joined a cattle buying business, then started selling insurance. The Gibsons had been on the farmstead for 3 generations, but 2 years after the Moneta school closed, Dad sold out to a neighbor and went into insurance full-time. He hated it, hated having to use scare tactics and lowball families in their time of need. He ended up working as a salesman for Crow Brand Seed. The neighbor who bought our land leveled our farmhouse, chopped down our trees, and turned the entire 160 acres into farmland. He even straightened the creek. Often drive by now without even recognizing it. The first 4 feet of our dirt driveway is all that remains of my childhood. Drive 15 minutes west of Spencer today, and there's still a sign on the side of the road for Moneta. Turn left. 2 miles down the pavement ends, leaving only a dirt track running between the fields. But there isn't a town. There may be 15 houses, at least half of them abandoned. There isn't a single business to be seen. Almost all the buildings on the old downtown strip I remember from my childhood are gone, replaced by a cornfield. You can stand at the former spot of the Moneta's General Store, where kids would stand transfixed on the front of a giant counter full of penny candies and whistles, and watch the cultivators' cone-shaped chutes in front and barrels of fertilizer and poison strapped in the back crawl across the fields like tiny grasshoppers tiptoeing across a vast emptiness. The dance hall remains, and the old speakeasy, but both are shuttered. In a few years, they'll probably be gone too. The Moneta school still stands behind, but volunteer trees are growing between the bricks. Most of the windows are broken. Goats lived in the building for a decade, wrecking the floors and biting holes in the walls, and you can still smell them. The only thing left is the reunion. 40 years after the closing of the Moneta school, the annual reunion still drew 1,000 people a year back to the field. 1,000 people a year back to the field where we used to hold those baseball games and end-of-year parties. Now the reunion is down to 100 or so. The school has been closed for 50 years. There aren't that many graduates left. Soon the sign on Highway 18 will be the last thing standing, still pointing 2 miles down the road, 2 miles down the lonely road to Moneta. And because, of course, I am not going to blue ball you, we're on chapter 7, and there is more Dewey being a little man. So I think we'll call it there for tonight. We're coming up on an hour. And like last night, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to another 3 chapters of Dewey. Before I let you go, make sure that you hydrate. Make sure that you take care of yourself. Make sure that you're being kind to those around you, and most importantly, be kind to yourself. Once again, I thank you for watching and hearing me out and coming back to listen to another three chapters of Dewey. And I hope to see you back here tomorrow for another 3, if not 4. Thanks for watching, and have a good night, y'all.